There's a feud between Iran and the West that spanned coups, sanctions, and standoffs.
The world's #1 state sponsor of terror.
Covert operation to overthrow Mossadegh.
The Shah, who had fled to Rome, comes home.
Hundreds of thousands take to the streets.
1979 turned everything upside down.
But it didn't start in 1979, or with Mossadegh, or even with Iran.
The largest empire the world had ever seen.
It goes back over 2,000 years to the Persian Empire. That's where we find one of the oldest stories ever told. The battle of good versus evil.
Erased from history.
Of freedom versus tyranny. Of valiant West versus despotic East.
And it's the victors who write the history books.
1,000 nations of the Persian Empire descend upon you.
This origin story helps us understand what has been unfolding for the past century, continuing into today. So if you want to understand why the West hates Persia, first you have to understand why it worships Greece.
The finest soldiers the world has ever known.
Hi everyone, it's Tala. Before we dive deeper, we want to give a special thank you to our supporters on Patreon. Doing this work takes time, resources, and editorial independence, so it wouldn't be possible without our supporters online. If you believe in what we're doing and want to be a part of this with us, you can join our Patreon. It's how we keep this going. Now back to the video.
A people glorious and arrogant, valiant and headstrong.
No other city has shaped the Western world so much as Athens.
In Western culture, ancient Greece is seen as the cradle of philosophy, science, and most importantly, as the birthplace of democracy. Entire university departments are dedicated to this era, called the classics, a name fitting for how these contributions are seen, as classic, foundational. That's because the West sees ancient Greece and Rome as the birthplaces of Western civilization.
Not only are you getting a better understanding of Greece and Western culture, but you're also sending a signal of the continuity that exists between what happened here and what happened with our founding fathers.
This first happened over 300 years ago during the Renaissance, when there was a rebirth of interest in ancient Greek art, literature, philosophy, and science after the so-called Dark Ages. Fun fact, this rebirth was possible because ancient Greek texts had been preserved in Arabic. Their translation into Latin made them accessible to Latin Europe, prompting the Renaissance. Then came the Enlightenment, where the thinkers of the time were reading and inspired by the works of ancient Greece and saw themselves as inheriting the legacy of Greek reason, logic, and inquiry. Athenian democracy was a symbolic ancestor for new ideas of liberty and citizenship. Ancient Greece became more than history. It became an origin story, the birthplace of Western civilization. Aristotle is called the father of logic. Socrates and Plato, fathers of philosophy. But most important for this story, Herodotus, the father of history, who's considered to have written the first major work of historical prose in Western literature.
So that the great and marvelous deeds of Greeks and barbarians should not go unsung.
And it's the history he recorded that would echo through Western thought for centuries. The history of the heroic Greeks.
The world will know that free men stood against a tyrant.
Against their enemy.
Embrace me as your king and as your god.
The Persians.
Yes!
No Greek would even hear the word Persian without terror.
Hundreds of peoples and tribes were forced to accept Persian rule and submit to a despotic regime.
The Persian Empire and Greek city-states fought many battles during a time known as the Greco-Persian Wars, like Marathon, Salamis, and Thermopylae, which you might know from the movie 300.
This is where we hold them!
And he wrote about them not as messy geopolitical struggles, but as moral epics, The Greeks were the free and brave underdogs fighting for liberty against the barbaric and cruel Persian monarchs. In his writings, Herodotus helped birth the idea of the tyrannical despotic East.
The tiny state of democratic Athens was gaining power. This was a threat that the Persians would have to destroy. The Athenians slaughtered over 6,000 Persians in one fateful day. The world's first democracy had survived its first great test.
Fast forward 2,000 years to the Renaissance, and the reading of his work coincided with another major chapter in Western European history: the discovery of new parts of the world, new peoples we know they would come to see as barbaric. And that framing never really died. In a way, he's the father of history and of the epic war between the civilized and the barbarians.
Without their success in this conflict, they would no doubt never have had the liberty, means, or conviction to invent, discover, or create all they did. Indeed, most of the cornerstones of modern civilization.
The problem is that this whole story gets a lot wrong.
Herodotus' account of the past seems burdened with much invented history.
Almost everything that we know about the Persian Empire actually comes from Greek sources. So it was written by their enemies.
Here's the reality.
The greatest empire the world had ever seen.
The Persian Empire began with the Achaemenid Empire and was founded by Kourosh, or Cyrus the Great. It was the largest the world had seen, stretching from Libya to India and home to nearly half the world's population. But unlike other empires, it thrived on tolerance.
And it shows the different peoples of the empire bringing their different tributes. And the Persian Empire, unlike others, didn't try to crush people into one way of being or doing. It allowed a great diversity of habits and patterns, language and faith to live together. It became the great model of how to run an empire of dizzying diversity.
The Cyrus cylinder guaranteed people the right to worship freely, speak their own languages, and return to their homelands. And it's often called the First Bill of Rights, written in 539 BC. Cyrus even funded the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, earning him praise in the Hebrew Bible. Later, King Darius
the Great
would expand this legacy, building roads, standardizing currency, and creating an administrative system so advanced it became a model for future empires.
Although Cyrus's empire was eventually broken up, the idea of Cyrus himself remained. Cyrus as the model ruler. The principal source for that view of Cyrus came from the Greek historian Xenophon. His book, Cyropedia, was really about how to run an empire with Cyrus as the model.
Historians and philosophers considered this work a masterpiece. It was also read by Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar.
It was very popular all through the Renaissance, and particularly with the founding fathers of America. And we know that Jefferson had 2, possibly 3 copies of Xenophon's Life of Cyrus and referred to it regularly.
Run along and tell your Xerxes he faces free men here, not slaves.
Actually, slavery was frowned upon under the Persians. The Greek city-states, on the other hand, were built on slavery. In fact, these Spartan fighters would have each owned their own slaves, who outnumbered Spartans by 7 to 1. Fearing rebellion, the Spartans would declare war on their slaves annually, allowing them to be killed with no legal repercussions. And they would target slaves deemed strong or likely to organize resistance. As for freedom, the only people who enjoyed democracy in ancient Greece were slave-owning men. And Persian history went on long after the Achaemenid Empire.
The frontal view depictions of Parthian art can be found in Christian artworks of the Byzantium and the Middle Ages 1,000 years after this empire's reign,
and continued to contribute to humanity. Ibn Sina's canon of medicine shaped European medical education for over 6 centuries. Al-Farabi expanded Aristotelian logic, laying groundwork for later Christian and Jewish scholastic thought. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra Al-Biruni accurately calculated the Earth's radius centuries before Galileo. And there's many more. These thinkers weren't peripheral. They were pillars of science, philosophy, math, medicine, poetry, architecture, spirituality, and their translated works would become essential reading during Europe's Renaissance.
There is a huge cultural difference between the Greeks and the Persians. It's a struggle between freedom and slavery.
History likes to paint in black and white, West versus East, good versus evil. But the truth is far more complex. Civilizations have always exchanged ideas, borrowed from each other, and built together. Persia was a major part of that story.
Multilingual teams labored on the huge task of translating documents by Arabs, Persians, and Greeks as literally as possible from Arabic into Latin. An intellectual golden age followed, leading to the founding of several universities during the Middle Ages.
This isn't just about history. It's about how history is weaponized. Because that old story, the West as the guardian of liberty and the East like Persia as the eternal threat, is alive and well today. And representing the West is its most recent 70-year-old invention, the settler colony called Israel.
It's a map of a curse, Iran's malignant arc.
By standing up for your freedom from an evil and oppressive regime.
God bless Israel and God bless America. Thank you very much.
Athenian Greece was once cast as the only democracy in a sea of Persian tyranny. Now it's Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, against big, scary Iran.
So it's a tiny country, tiny, surrounded, well, shall we say, living in a very tough neighborhood. Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. Iran lies.
Iran is still framed as the looming irrational threat, even when it's Israel that launched the war.
The people of Israel don't want this war. There is one force putting your family in grave danger. The tyrants of Tehran.
Western civilization defines itself by reason, liberty, freedom. But these traditions were refined, if not born, in the East. And the irony is ridiculous, because from the birth of this myth all the way until today, the West has repeatedly undermined liberty and freedom, especially here. So when the West tells you who they are and who their enemies are, ask who wrote the story and who got written out.